They say there is nothing more terrifying than the silence of someone pushed to their limit. Alice stayed silent when her daughter-in-law humiliated her. She stayed silent when her food was hidden and her keys were changed. But that day, when scalding coffee was poured onto her arm, the silence shattered. Her daughter-in-law had made a fatal mistake. She thought Alice was a shadow, unable to resist. But she didn't know that Shadow was concealing a plan to expose her true colors and take back everything that belonged to Alice. A scar in exchange for an entire fortune. Let's see who truly loses everything. Before we begin the story, comment and tell us where you're watching this from, and follow along on this journey for justice. Alice, at 75 years old, knew every crack, every shadow, and every smell of the house she had built with decades of silent work. The room at the back of the property wasn't just a place to sleep. It was her refuge, her trench, and in recent years, the only border between her peace and the daily harassment she felt. The whitewashed walls had stains that told stories of old rains. The tin roof, dented by hail from past seasons, sang with every night's wind. There she had raised Robert, her only son, since she was widowed young. There she had also dreamed of welcoming grandchildren, surrounded by laughter and the smell of coffee. But things changed when Robert married Megan. In the past, he consulted her for every decision, as if his mother's advice were law. Now, they barely made eye contact. Every time something was decided in the house, he repeated the same phrase that drilled into her heart. Whatever Megan says, Mom. I have asked myself that 1,000 times. But when you watch the son you raised choose his own false peace, you realize you lost him long before he stopped meeting your eyes. He didn't just choose his wife, he chose not to fight. That voluntary surrender was the worst wound. Megan, possessing an explosive temper and a sharp tongue, had found a weapon in that power. From the first day, she didn't hide her rejection. Sometimes she dressed it in sarcasm, other times with a contempt so direct it chilled the air. A nuisance, a burden, a nosy old woman. These were words she had heard more than once, always said with that twisted smile that preceded something worse. This was not a new war. It was a slow, grinding siege that had lasted for years. Alice had long ago perfected the art of becoming invisible. She learned to read the rhythm of Megan's footsteps in the hallway. Heavy and fast meant anger, a signal to stay hidden. She shrank herself, made her needs smaller and smaller, until she felt like a ghost in the very home she had built. The insults were sharp, but the shame was a heavier, constant ache. The shame of being seen as a burden, the shame of her own son's silence. She told herself she endured it for Robert's sake, and then for Ethan's. But deep in the quiet of her room, she knew she was also just afraid. Afraid of the final, definitive break. Afraid of what it meant to be 75 and truly, utterly alone. Alice endured, not out of weakness, but for Ethan. Her grandson, already in college, maintained a spark of tenderness that anchored her to that house. He came in through the back door almost every day, with a bag of warm bread and a smile that lit up the room. Sitting to eat together, listening to him talk about school or jokes with his friends, brought a little color back to her day. That afternoon, the smell of soap filled the room while Alice folded freshly washed tablecloths. She spread them out carefully, smoothing every wrinkle like someone organizing their thoughts. She hadn't finished when a shadow was cast in the doorway. Megan was there, leaning against the wall, arms crossed and a thin, almost invisible smile that carried venom. "You'll be out of here soon," she whispered, as if it were a secret between friends. The sentence cut through the air like a knife. Alice looked up and held her gaze without saying a word. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she knew any response would be used against her. In the yard, the sun was setting with a soft warmth, but in the room, the temperature dropped as if a thick cloud had covered everything. Megan left without closing the door completely, leaving behind a trail of cheap perfume mixed with the accumulated tension. Alice remained standing, tablecloths clutched in her hands. She took a deep breath, dropped the fabric on the table, and sat on the bed. The silence of the room didn't hide the noise in her mind. She reviewed the past few weeks. The drawers moved, the keys appearing in impossible places, the food disappearing from the pantry. They weren't oversights, they were invisible blows, small stabs meant to wear her down. Do you see? That is how it begins. Not with a shout, but with invisible stabs. They want you to think you are losing your mind, that it is just old age. But I knew. It was a war, just one without blood. Yet, the sound of the gate opening broke her thoughts. It was Ethan, backpack on his shoulder, walking quickly. He came straight to the room, dropped his backpack on the floor, and gave her a kiss on the forehead. On the table, he placed a bag of steaming, savory turnovers. "Grandma, don't eat what's in the kitchen. It smells weird," he whispered, looking toward the hallway. Alice felt a pang in her chest. It wasn't the first time her grandson had noticed something strange. He knew. A child always knows. He was quiet not because he didn't care. He was quiet because he was watching, and he was listening. He was sharpening his own weapons. Ethan's silence was a trap, not a surrender. They sat down to eat the turnovers, and while Ethan talked about a difficult exam, she watched him with a heavy heart. He tried to lighten the moment, but his eyes revealed concern. A sharp bang from the living room interrupted their chat. Megan was arguing on the phone, and her voice filtered clearly through the half-open door. "I'm telling you, she's leaving soon. I can't stand another week with this old woman here." They heard it. Ethan clenched his fists, but Alice put her hand on his, as if asking him not to react. "Don't worry about me, son," she said with a calm that was more for him than for herself. When night fell, Ethan hugged her before leaving, tighter than usual, as if trying to leave her an invisible shield. She heard his footsteps fade down the hall and the gate slam shut. The silence returned, but this time it was a different, heavier silence. She got up and opened the drawer where she kept a small hardcover notebook. On the first page, written in tight script, was the title, "What is Not Forgotten." She ran her finger over the latest entries. August 14th, the milk disappeared. August 18th, the wardrobe key was changed. August 21st, food spoiled. Each line was a documented wound. She closed the notebook and left it on the table, like leaving a weapon ready. After 10, she heard footsteps in the hall. The door creaked open, and Megan appeared, leaning against the frame, feigning kindness. "Still awake?" she asked, in a sweet voice that fooled no one. "I always have trouble sleeping when there's so much noise," Alice replied, looking at her without blinking. The tension stretched for a few seconds until Megan turned on her heels and walked away, leaving the door ajar, as if she wanted the discomfort to stay inside. Alice turned off the light, but she didn't sleep. Outside, in the dimness, Megan's voice filtered in again, almost a murmur. "You'll be out of here soon." Alice closed her eyes, not to rest, but to engrave every word, because she knew that one day that seemingly innocent notebook would be the key to leaving that room and never returning as the defeated woman Megan thought she was. The morning chills seeped through the crack in the window. Alice opened her eyes to the smell of coffee, but when she got to the kitchen, she only found an empty cup on the table and the coffee maker off. In the pantry, the sugar jar had disappeared. It wasn't the first time. The week before, the bag of rice had vanished, and days earlier, the bottle of oil had appeared in the trash can, half full. There was no possible accident. Each loss had a target, and it was always the same hand that caused them. Megan was in the living room checking her phone, her nails painted red, an expression of studied boredom on her face. "Did you look hard enough?" she asked, without looking up. Alice didn't answer. She knew that tone. It was an invitation to a fight. She walked back to her room, feeling the floorboards creak under her bare feet, and opened the drawer where she kept her hardcover notebook. She wrote in small letters, 8:15 a.m. Sugar disappeared. Megan was present in the living room. She closed the notebook carefully, like someone storing evidence. At noon, while hanging clothes in the yard, she heard the metallic sound of keys jingling. She turned her head just in time to see Megan closing the door to her room. "Did you lose something?" she asked, smiling innocently. "I just came for the bucket," Alice lied, although she knew perfectly well there was no reason for her daughter-in-law to be in there. Later, when she tried to open her wardrobe to get a blouse, the usual key didn't fit. She checked her keys one by one. She tried 3 times. Nothing. Another change. Another signal. She returned to the notebook. 2:30 p.m. lock changed. No warning. Robert arrived that night, tired, the smell of his commute clinging to his coat. He found Megan in the kitchen, speaking to him in a low, rapid voice. When Alice entered, the conversation stopped. "Robert, your mom says I went into her room," Megan began in a wounded tone. "Imagine, me, who respects her space so much." Robert ran a hand over his face. "Don't make drama, please," he murmured without looking at them. Alice felt the weight of those words. Don't make drama was the quickest way to dismiss her. She remained silent because every word she said was returned as a reproach. But Ethan, who was sitting at the table with an open notebook, looked up. His eyes moved from his father to his mother, as if trying to read what wasn't being said. The next day, Alice went to get bread to go with her afternoon coffee. When she returned, the package she had left on the counter was gone. She found crumbs in the sink and the empty bag in the trash. It fell and got ruined, Megan explained, shrugging. Alice didn't respond. She went to her room, took out the notebook, and wrote, 4:10 p.m., bread thrown out on purpose. That evening, while setting the table, Megan made a casual comment in front of Robert. "Your mom almost burned the pot today." "That's not true," Alice said without raising her voice. "Of course it is," Megan insisted. "Ethan was there, right?" "I didn't see anything," the young man replied, looking back down at his notes. The silence that followed was more eloquent than any argument. Megan smiled, satisfied, as if she had won an invisible point. Alice took a deep breath, served the coffee, and went to her room without eating a bite. During that week, the small cruelties multiplied. The detergent mixed with water, the damp clothes put away in the closet so they would smell like mildew, the radio unplugged just when she was listening to her favorite program. Each incident found its place in the notebook, with the time and a brief description. That notebook was filling up faster than ever. One afternoon, while cleaning the table after lunch, she heard the landline phone ringing in the living room. Megan answered and activated the speakerphone without realizing it. Her voice was heard clearly, mockingly, as if talking to a friend. "One day I'm dragging her out of here. You'll see." Alice froze, rag in hand, feeling the blood rush to her face. It wasn't the first veiled threat, but hearing it like this, so clearly, was different. She turned her head and saw Ethan in the hallway, also listening. Their eyes met, and he frowned, as if making a silent promise. The pain of humiliation is worse than any whip. When the grandchild you love must witness your weakness, hear them call you a burden. You know that silence is no longer an option. That look from Ethan, that was when I knew I was no longer fighting alone. She closed her eyes for an instant, recording the phrase in her memory before writing it in her notebook, because she knew that those pages would one day speak louder than any lie. The morning dawned gray and damp, with a cold wind seeping through the cracks and making the tin roof creak. Alice got up early as always, wrapping herself in her shawl before going out to the hallway that led to the kitchen. The freezing floor reminded her that winter was near. She lit the stove burner with hands accustomed to the routine. She placed the metal coffee pot on the flame, and the smell of freshly ground coffee began to fill the air. That aroma had always meant more to her than just a drink. It was home, company, warmth in the midst of any loneliness. She moved slowly, watching the brew. Every time she made coffee, she thought of Ethan. She remembered how as a child he would wait for the first cup and take it with both hands, blowing on the surface before taking a sip and smiling. Although he was a busy college student now, he still came in through the back door and sat with her to drink it, as if that gesture united them. As she poured the dark liquid into a glass pitcher, she heard quick, firm steps approaching down the hall. Megan appeared in the doorway, her hair disheveled and her eyes blazing. The energy she carried wasn't that of someone who had just woken up, but of someone who had been accumulating rage. "At it again with your tricks?" she snapped, without a greeting. "I'm just making coffee for everyone," Alice replied, without turning completely. "Don't play dumb," Megan retorted, entering. "I know you're manipulating Ethan to turn him against me." Alice placed the pitcher on the table and turned to face her, calmly. "I don't manipulate anyone. I just talked to my grandson," she said, measuring every word. But Alice's calm was like gasoline for Megan. In a movement that lasted a second but felt eternal to Alice, Megan approached the burner, grabbed the still bubbling coffee pot, and lifted it aggressively. "Well, learn not to meddle where you're not wanted," she screamed. The stream of scalding coffee fell onto Alice's right arm. The impact was brutal, an immediate, sharp pain that spread to her shoulder. The smell of burned skin mixed with the sweet aroma of coffee, making the air unbreathable. The pitcher she was holding slipped from her hands and shattered on the floor, splashing more hot liquid. The scream that came from her throat was short and hoarse. Her knees gave way, and she fell sideways, catching herself with her left hand to avoid hitting her face. The shawl crumpled beneath her as she tried to pull her arm away from the fabric to prevent it from sticking to the skin. The burning was unbearable. Every passing second seemed to fan the invisible flames engulfing her. Megan slammed the coffee pot onto the table, crossed her arms, and looked down at her. "That'll teach you," she said in a flat tone, colder than the wind coming through the window. The physical pain was agonizing, but it was that cold, heartless look from Megan that truly woke something up in Alice. This single act of cruelty just sealed Megan's fate, though she doesn't know it yet. Keep listening to see who arrives at this exact moment. You must not try to find reason in cruelty. It is like asking why ice is cold. It simply is. The physical pain was nothing compared to the cold in that gaze. It was that cold that woke me up. Alice tried to get up, but the pain was a white-hot sheet, nailing her to the floor. But in that second, the physical burn felt distant. What truly seared her was the humiliation. The tears that came were not for the skin, but for the soul. To be reduced to this, a thing on the floor of her own kitchen, looked upon with such casual cruelty. In that instant, something deeper than the pain broke. It was the last thread of her long, silent endurance. The years of shrinking, of hiding, of swallowing her words, they all seemed to curdle and burn away with the coffee. She wasn't just a woman in pain. She was a woman who had finally, terribly, had enough. The back door flew open. Ethan entered, scarf around his neck and a folder under his arm. The first thing he saw was his grandmother crumpled on the floor, her arm reddened, steam still rising from the spilled coffee. His eyes went from that image to Megan, who remained motionless, chin high. "What did you do to her?" His voice trembled with fury. He ran to Alice, kneeling beside her. With firm but careful hands, he lifted her injured arm and saw the reddened, shiny skin and small blisters beginning to form. The heat radiating from it was unbearable even for him. "This is serious," he exclaimed, looking at Megan. "You're sick. Don't exaggerate," she replied, shrugging, and walked out of the kitchen as if nothing had happened. Ethan didn't waste time arguing. "Grandma, we're going to the clinic now," he said, putting his arm around her back to help her stand. The hallway felt endless. Each step awakened a new throb of pain in Alice's arm, as if something was biting her from the inside. Outside, the cold wind hit her face, and she pressed her lips together to keep from moaning. Ethan settled her in the car seat, gently draping his clean cotton scarf loosely over her arm, careful that the fabric only shielded it from the air without sticking to the skin. He started the engine and pulled out onto the street, driving with one hand while holding his grandmother's with the other. She stared straight ahead, her eyes fixed and moist, occasionally closing her eyelids as if to hold in the pain and rage. Between the noise of the engine and the wind, Ethan thought of only one thing. That day, something had changed forever. Alice, her arm burning, and her head held high, knew it too. That burn hadn't just marked her skin. It had drawn a definitive line between what she was willing to endure and what she was not. And Megan, without knowing it, had just crossed it. Ethan's car screeched to a halt in front of the local urgent care. He barely had time to put the car in park before getting out to open the door for his grandmother. The cold morning air rushed in immediately, sharp as glass. Alice felt the contrast with her burning arm make her shudder even more. The pain wasn't just a sting. It felt like a living pulse, a throb that shot from her wrist to her shoulder and gave no relief. "Slowly, Grandma," Ethan said, placing a hand on her back to help her out. The two walked along the sidewalk to the entrance. Each step was a small effort for Alice, who felt the skin tighten under the improvised bandage of the scarf. The automatic glass door opened, releasing an antiseptic smell that, mixed with the coffee on her clothes, turned her stomach. Behind the counter, a nurse looked up and immediately stopped typing. "What happened?" she asked, standing up. "A burn," Ethan replied, his tone still urgent. "She needs immediate attention." The nurse came forward, pointed them down a hallway, and opened the door to an exam room. "Wait here," she told Alice. "I'll get the doctor." A few seconds later, the door opened, and Dr. Emily, a woman with her hair pulled back and a penetrating gaze, entered. She wore an impeccable white coat and had a stethoscope hung around her neck that she barely used. She was known in the neighborhood for treating everyone with the same frankness and care. Seeing Alice, her brow furrowed. "What happened?" she asked, looking her straight in the eye. "She had scalding coffee thrown on her," Ethan intervened. Dr. Emily raised a hand for him to be silent. "I want to hear it from you, Alice." Alice tried to speak, but the pain made her clench her lips. Dr. Emily put on gloves, gently removed the scarf covering the arm, and placed it on a tray. The cold air hit the red, inflamed skin, and Alice let out a small, stifled whimper. Dr. Emily bent down and observed the burn. It had darker areas and others that were shiny, as if the skin had been stretched to its limit. "Superficial and deep second degree in some areas," she murmured, assessing it. "We need to clean this now." She took a small digital camera from a drawer and began taking pictures from different angles. "These photos are part of the medical record," she explained. "They will also be useful if you decide to press charges." Alice remained silent, though her ragged breathing said it all. Ethan stood by her, his hand on her shoulder. Dr. Emily grabbed gauze and a bottle of saline solution. At the contact of the cool liquid, the intense heat of the burn subsided slightly, but the necessary process of cleaning the wound drew a tear that rolled down Alice's cheek. The doctor didn't stop. She knew every second counted to prevent infection. "This is going to sting a bit more," she warned, as she applied a special burn cream and recovered the area with sterile gauze held by a bandage. Then she noted the time and the state of the injury in the medical chart. When she finished the bandaging, instead of ending the consultation, Dr. Emily took the examination light and looked at the entire arm, the neck, and part of the torso. She frowned when she saw yellowish bruises in different stages of healing. "And these marks?" she asked. "I tripped over a chair last week," Alice replied, avoiding her gaze. "I tripped. I walked into a door. How many times do you tell the lie? You lie because you are ashamed. You lie to keep the peace. But old bruises never truly fade. They just wait for a new wound, one big enough to tell the whole story. And these others on your shoulder? That was a while ago." Dr. Emily didn't press further at that moment, but her expression spoke volumes. She straightened up and looked at Ethan. "Can I speak with your grandmother alone?" He hesitated, but nodded and left the exam room. When the door closed, Dr. Emily moved closer and spoke in a low voice. "Alice, I've been treating you for years. I can tell the difference between an accident and repeated assault. What I see here isn't from just one time. I need you to tell me the truth." Alice took a deep breath, but she couldn't hold it in. The tears began to fall, at first in silence, then accompanied by a choked sob that had been held back for too long. "Ever since my son got married, not a day goes by that I'm not humiliated. Hiding food, changed keys, insults, shoves, and he stays quiet. Today she burned me with coffee. It wasn't an accident. It was because I confronted her, because I didn't stay silent. After years of silent suffering, the truth is finally spoken to someone who will listen. This isn't just a doctor's visit anymore. It's the beginning of an alliance. And Dr. Emily knows exactly who to call to turn this fight around. Stay with us to meet her." Dr. Emily took her hand and waited for her to calm down a bit. "Do you want to keep living like this?" she asked. "No," Alice whispered. "Then I'm going to help you, not just as your doctor, but as someone who won't let this happen again." She stood up and opened the door to call Ethan, who entered with a tense face. "Alice, you need protective measures," Dr. Emily said firmly. "I know a lawyer who specializes in elder defense." I'm going to call her right now. She's very fast. Doctor, Emily made the call, explaining the urgency while looking at Alice with reassurance. After hanging up, she turned to them. Her name is Catherine Hayes. She's diverting from another appointment and will be here in less than 30 minutes. While they waited, Ethan looked at his grandmother, who was pale under the harsh clinic lights. Grandma, you haven't eaten. I'll be right back. He hurried out to the clinic's small cafeteria, returning a moment later with a bottle of water and a small package of cookies. He helped Alice take a small sip, knowing that the shock and pain could make her dizzy. Just as she finished, the door opened and the lawyer arrived. He pushed open the exam room door without waiting to be let in. Inside, he found Alice sitting on the exam table, her arm bandaged with clean layers of gauze, her gaze lowered, as if still trying to process what had happened. Across from her, Dr. Emily was organizing papers on her desk. I have everything, Dr. Emily said, lifting a blue folder. Medical report, photographs of the injuries, risk assessment, all dated and timed, signed and sealed. Ethan left the bag on the side table and approached to take the folder. He opened it and saw the printed images. His grandmother's arm, red, swollen, with the first blisters appearing. The older stains that time had tried to erase, but were there like silent witnesses. Each photo was a blow to his patience. There's no turning back from this, he said, his voice thick with determination. Alice didn't look up. The words risk assessment sounded like a judgment that wasn't just against Megan, but also dragged Robert into it. Pressing charges meant breaking something that, although practically broken, still existed on paper. The family. And all her life, she had maintained that you don't take family to court. Dr. Emily sensed her hesitation. She walked slowly until she stood in front of Alice. Alice, you know I don't like to pressure people, but what happened today wasn't an accident, and what I've seen on your body isn't from just one day either. If we don't act now, this could happen again, or end worse. You have the right to live peacefully, and I can help you make that happen. It's my son, Alice whispered, barely moving her lips. I don't want him. Ethan stepped forward, stood beside the exam table, and took his grandmother's hand. He didn't squeeze it gently, but with the force of someone making it clear he was there to support her. Grandma, family is who takes care of you, not who burns you. The simple phrase cut the air like a knife. Alice looked at him and saw not the child she used to protect from storms, but the man who was now willing to stand in front of any storm for her. She felt something strange, a warmth different from the pain, one that came from within, and told her she was no longer alone in facing what was to come. Dr. Emily seized the moment. I'm going to call a lawyer specializing in elder law. I trust her completely. She'll come here or to your house, wherever you feel safest. The first step is to sign the legal representation so she can act on your behalf. With the risk assessment and the evidence we have, we can request immediate measures, a restraining order, and if the judge decides, have that person out of your house in a matter of hours. Alice took a deep breath, looked at the clean bandage, and remembered how her skin had burned just a little while ago, how Megan had looked at her coldly after throwing the coffee. She thought of the changed keys, the hidden food, the insults she could no longer erase. It was all there, like pieces of a puzzle she had always tried to disassemble so she wouldn't see the full picture. Now that picture was unavoidable. Okay, she said finally, and though it was a whisper, her tone didn't tremble. Let's do it. Ethan smiled faintly, squeezing her hand a little tighter. It's not revenge, Grandma. It's justice, and we're going to win. Doctor. Emily dialed a number on her phone, but while she waited for an answer, she continued preparing the file. Papers in order, clips securing each set, the photos in transparent sleeves to protect them. When the lawyer gets here, I want you to tell her everything, from the beginning. Don't leave anything out, even if it seems small. Every detail counts. Alice nodded. She still felt the weight of fear in her chest, but also a strange lightness, the feeling of having taken a step she had always avoided. The silence that followed wasn't one of resignation, but of preparation. Ethan helped her off the exam table, put the jacket over her shoulders, and zipped it up to the top, as if trying to wrap her in something more than just fabric. He settled her comfortably, making sure the bandage was protected. Outside, the sky had turned darker, and the wind beat against the clinic's windows. Just then, Ethan's cell phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, saw the name on the screen, and clenched his jaw. "Robert," he answered flatly. "What do you want?" he asked, curtly. "Where are you?" Robert's voice was strained. "Come back now." Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked at his grandmother, who was watching him with a new calm, and he knew that this call wouldn't change what they had already decided. Not even 30 minutes had passed since Dr. Emily made the call when the exam room door opened decisively. A woman in a dark suit, her hair pulled back in an impeccable bun, and a black briefcase in her hand, entered without wasting time on polite greetings. Her shoes clicked firmly on the tile floor. "I am attorney Catherine Hayes," she said, looking first at Alice and then at Ethan. "The doctor explained the basics to me on the phone. Now I need to hear everything from you." Ethan stepped forward, but Catherine held up her palm. "First, Mrs. Alice." Alice swallowed. The bandage on her arm reminded her every second of what had happened that morning. In a slow but clear voice, she began to recount, starting with the small incidents, the hidden food, the changed keys, the baseless accusations. Then she moved on to the shoves, the insults, Robert's indifference. Finally, she told how Megan had entered the kitchen that morning and thrown the scalding coffee on her. Catherine listened without interrupting, taking quick notes in a hardcover notebook. Occasionally, she would look up, as if to measure the firmness of Alice's words. When she finished, she closed the notebook with a soft snap. "This is not a family squabble, Alice. This is violence, and it's classified as a crime, and we are going to treat it as such." Ethan breathed a sigh of relief upon hearing the conviction in the lawyer's voice. Dr. Emily, from the side, nodded, confirming she was in the right hands. "Our plan is clear," Catherine continued. "First, we protect you. You cannot be alone with that woman again. Second, we will gather all the evidence, audio, messages, witnesses. What we already have from the medical report and photos is a solid start, but I want more. Third, we will request immediate protective measures so she cannot come near you, and simultaneously, we will prepare the lawsuit for assault and battery." She opened her briefcase and took out a multi-page document. "This is the legal representation agreement. It authorizes me to act on your behalf. Without it, I can't move on anything. Read it if you like, but I need your signature today." Alice took the paper with her good hand. She didn't know about laws, but she understood that this paper was a shield. She read it slowly, line by line, while Catherine clarified each section in simple terms. Ethan leaned in beside her, following the sentences with his finger. When she reached the end, Alice took the pen and signed, writing her full name in a firm hand. "Done," Catherine said, placing the document in a folder. "Now, let's get to work." She took out her phone and looked at Ethan. "Do you have the audio files you mentioned saved?" "Yes, all on my phone," he replied, pulling it from his pocket. He handed it to her, and Catherine connected a small adapter to transfer the files to her laptop. The screen filled with a list of dates and times. Perfect. "Let's listen." She played the first one. Megan's voice, loaded with contempt, accused Alice of meddling where she wasn't wanted and promising that one day she would kick her out of the house. The second audio captured an argument where Robert remained silent while his wife hurled insults. But it was the third one that made the atmosphere in the exam room even more tense. "I'll get her out, even if I have to kick her out." Megan's voice was loud, unwavering, as if she had planned it. Catherine paused the playback, closed the laptop, and looked directly at Alice. "This is enough to start." Dr. Emily, in the background, let out a short exhale, as if she had been holding her breath. Ethan squeezed his grandmother's hand, and for the first time in a long time, Alice felt that the words so often trapped in her throat were about to transform into real actions. The morning had dawned gray, but in the small clinic room where Catherine, the lawyer, had set up a sort of command center, there was no room for cold or stillness. On a long table, folders, letterhead, pens, recorders, a laptop, and a small printer that Dr. Emily had rounded up were piled, ready to print statements on the spot. The air smelled of fresh coffee and new paper. Alice sat by the window, her arm bandaged, a warm mug in her hands, watching how, for the first time in many years, people were working exclusively to protect her. Catherine reviewed a document and looked up. "We will take the witnesses' statements in order, so everything is clear and documented. I want the time, date, signature, and a copy of each person's ID. No unnecessary formalities, but everything in the format the courthouse requires," she explained in a precise tone. The door opened, and Mrs. Helen, a neighbor for life, appeared. Her white hair was pulled up in a high bun, her hands weathered from decades of washing other people's clothes. She walked in firmly and greeted Alice with a handshake that conveyed more support than any words. "I'm here to tell the truth," she affirmed, before sitting down across from the lawyer. Catherine placed the recorder on the table and opened her notebook. "Tell me, Mrs. Helen. I saw her," she began without hesitation. "I saw when her daughter-in-law pushed her against the wall. It wasn't just once. Another time, I remember she threw a basket of clean clothes on the floor and kicked it. Alice bent down to pick it up without saying a word, and that hurt me more than the push." "Do you remember approximate dates?" Catherine asked. "The last push was a Wednesday, right before the garbage truck passed. I always hear it at 9:30, so it would be around that time." Catherine typed everything while the recorder captured every detail. Then she printed the statement, read it aloud, and asked for Mrs. Helen's signature. "Doctor." Emily took a copy of her ID card and walked her to the door. The next to enter was Gary, the security guard on the corner, a tall man with leathery skin and a deep voice. He wore a wool cap and still smelled of early morning coffee. "I didn't see the blows," he admitted, "but I heard insults many times. From my gate, you could hear it clearly. She yelled, 'Old woman, useless burden,' and one night, she even threatened to force her out of her house." Catherine turned on a speaker and played one of Ethan's audio files. "Listen and tell me if you recognize the voice." As soon as the first words played, Gary raised his hand. "That's her. I'd recognize it anywhere." His testimony was recorded and signed with a copy of his ID saved in an envelope. Then Jason, the bread and grocery delivery guy, came in. He was young, but his expression was hardened. He took off his cap and looked at Alice seriously. "I bring her order every week. More than once, I saw her with bruises on her arms. When I asked, she'd say she hit herself, but I didn't believe her. One day, I saw her daughter-in-law snatch the bag from her and throw her change on the floor. I was stunned." "Describe the bruises," Catherine requested. "Size, color, location." They were about 2 inches, greenish and yellow, on her upper arm. Everything was noted, printed, and signed. Before leaving, Jason paused by Alice. "Sorry for not saying anything sooner. I thought it was a family matter, but now I know I was wrong to stay quiet." Dr. Emily returned with several envelopes in her hand. "Here is the complete medical certificate," she reported. "It includes the current and old injuries, each with a date and type." Catherine turned the pages slowly. "This shows a pattern, not an isolated event," she said with slight satisfaction. "This carries a lot of weight in court." Ethan, who had been checking his phone until that moment, approached with a sheaf of papers. "Here are the screenshots of the voice and text messages, all with date and time stamps. I also made a chronological list of the audio files and have backups in the cloud." The lawyer reviewed them and separated the most compromising ones. Direct insults, explicit threats, Robert's complicit silences while Megan spoke. "We will include the metadata as well," she explained, "so no one can claim the audio was manipulated." The black folder was now heavy, full. Signed testimonies, photos of injuries, medical certificates, clear audio, written messages, dates, locations, and precise descriptions. Alice looked at all that material as if they were bricks in a wall that was finally beginning to protect her. Catherine closed the folder with a dry click. She held it in her hand, feeling its real and symbolic weight. "Tomorrow, the courthouse," she said in a confident voice, looking at Alice. "We are going to request the abuser's removal within 48 hours. In that instant, Alice, who had spent years accumulating silences, understood that there was no going back. The truth now weighed more than fear. The news spread through the neighborhood before the morning was over. No one needed to tell the full story. A few phrases from neighbors and a couple of social media posts were enough for everyone to know that Alice had been assaulted and that a complaint was now filed. The scalding coffee, the medical evidence, the audio files, it all spread like wildfire. At the corner bakery, the owner muttered while wrapping a bread roll, "Poor Alice. How dare they?" At the fruit stand, a customer commented in a low voice, "I always suspected that daughter-in-law. She has the face of a snake." Every corner, every sidewalk seemed to hold a piece of the story. The indignation soon took the form of concrete gestures. At noon, someone left a bag of freshly baked bread at the door of the room where Alice was staying. Next to the bag, a note written in a hurried hand, "You are not alone. We are with you." Ethan found it when he returned with clean blankets. He picked it up and read it aloud. "See, Grandma? People know who's who," he said, placing the bread on the table. On social media, the outrage grew. A neighbor who had recorded a video of Megan yelling at Alice in the street posted it with the caption, "This is elder abuse. Enough is enough." In a few hours, the video was shared dozens of times. The comments were filled with messages of support and also warnings. "They better not dare touch her again. We are ready to testify if necessary." Robert, meanwhile, was beginning to feel the weight of rejection. When he left the house to go to the convenience store, two neighbors who used to greet him with a good morning turned their faces away without a word. Others directly crossed the street to avoid looking at him. That indifference hurt more than any insult. At the clinic, Catherine continued working on the file. Ethan came in and told her he wanted to get his grandmother out of the house as soon as possible, even before the judge ordered the measures. "That's for the best," the lawyer agreed. "A safe place until the ruling is issued." That same afternoon, Ethan took Alice to a room a friend had offered him. It was small, but clean and quiet. A bed with freshly washed sheets, a nightstand with a lamp, and a window that let in the cool evening air. Alice surveyed the space, touching the wood of the headboard, smelling the freshness of the blankets. "You can rest here without fear," Ethan said, placing her bag by the bed. For the first time in a long time, Alice allowed herself to lock the door and feel that turning the key left the danger outside. She sat on the edge of the bed and took a deep breath. The silence of that room wasn't filled with tension, but with calm. While Ethan arranged some water bottles and the bag of bread the neighbors had left, outside, night was falling, and somewhere in the neighborhood, the conversation about her continued. But now, in that room, the only thing that could be heard was the steady beat of her decision. Robert arrived in the mid-afternoon, when the sunlight slanted through the window of the room where Alice had been staying since Ethan took her from the house. He didn't call or wait for permission. He pushed the door open with his hand and walked in, closing it behind him. His heavy footsteps echoed on the wooden floor. He wore a wrinkled jacket, his shirt poorly buttoned, and an expression that mixed anger, exhaustion, and a hint of shame. "You're going to destroy us, Mom." He blurted it out without a greeting, as if he'd been rehearsing the line since he left his house. "You have no idea the damage you're doing." Damage? He worried about the walls, about his own shame. He never once asked about my burn. When a man cares more for his reputation than his own blood, he has already destroyed himself. Alice was sitting on the edge of the bed, her bandaged arm resting in her lap. She didn't stand up. She didn't get flustered. She just looked at him with the same eyes that had once watched him take his first steps and now faced him as a stranger. "Family isn't who hurts you. It's who takes care of you," she replied, pronouncing each word like a stone carefully placed in a wall she was building between them. Robert made a gesture of annoyance. He paced the room like a caged animal. "She's my wife. Mom, don't you understand? What did you expect? That I'd stay quiet while you humiliate her in front of everyone? This thing you're doing, getting lawyers, police, it's going to destroy what's left of us." Alice gripped the blanket with her free hand, not out of insecurity, but to control the rage that threatened to rise in her voice. "I didn't humiliate her. She burned me. And you were there, Robert. Not just today. You've always been there, watching and staying silent." He averted his gaze, as if some corner of the room held a justification for his silence. Things could have been sorted out at home. Why did you take it this far? He's worried about being seen as a monster, not about the monster he allowed his wife to become. But Alice isn't the one who's afraid anymore. And this little talk is about to be interrupted by someone Robert definitely doesn't want to meet. Keep listening. Because there was no fixing things in that house anymore, Alice said with icy calm. There was only a place where I served as a target for her anger, and you as a silent witness. In the doorway, Ethan watched the scene. His hands were in his pockets, but his posture was tense, ready to intervene if his father crossed the line. He knew, however, that this moment belonged to his grandmother, and he held back. Robert tried to soften his voice, as if a lower tone could reverse what was already done. Mom, people are talking. They see us as monsters. This is going to mark us forever. What marked me were the humiliations, the sleepless nights, the days you hid food from me, the insults you thought were forgotten the next day, Alice retorted. And what hurts most, Robert, is that it all happened with your silent consent. The silence that followed was thick. You could hear the distant hum of a fan in the adjacent clinic. Alice did not look away. Robert, however, looked down, as if his shoes were suddenly the only safe place to look. The door opened, and Catherine, the lawyer, entered with a folder in her hand. She hadn't expected to find them like this, but her professional instinct kicked in instantly. Is everything all right here? She asked, placing the folder on the table. We're talking, Robert replied, not hiding his annoyance. Let's call it what it is, Catherine said, stepping forward. This is pressure, and I'm warning you, if you do it again, I will inform the judge. It will be registered as an attempt to manipulate and intimidate the complainant. That won't help you, believe me. Robert straightened up, but didn't reply. His breathing was heavy. His hands clenched and unclenched, as if looking for a place to put his rage. He took a step toward the door, but before leaving, he turned. This isn't going to end well for anyone, he said, and slammed the door. He was wrong. That was the beginning of a good end. For me. Sometimes, a slammed door is the sound of freedom. That slam. It wasn't a threat. It was the last lock turning on my prison. Silence once again took over the room. Alice let out the breath she didn't know she was holding. Ethan approached and sat beside her, placing a hand on hers. He can't scare you anymore, Grandma, Catherine murmured. She opened the folder and took out some papers. It was likely he'd try this, she said. That's why I want a witness present whenever he or Megan approaches. And if they pressure you again, you call me immediately, even if it's the middle of the night. Alice nodded. There was no fear in her face, only exhaustion and a determination that grew with every step. Catherine's phone vibrated on the table. She picked it up, read the message, and showed it to them both. On the screen, the official notification was clear. Hearing scheduled, mandatory appearance for Megan and Robert. The letters seemed heavier than any words spoken that afternoon. It was confirmation that very soon all the truth that had been ignored for years would have to be heard by a judge in front of everyone, with no possibility of silencing it again. Dawn found Alice awake long before Ethan's alarm clock went off. She hadn't slept more than a couple of hours, not from lack of exhaustion, but because the image of the courthouse played over and over in her mind. She had pictured Megan with her twisted smile, trying to interrupt, Robert avoiding her gaze, and herself sitting with her rosary, determined not to bow her head ever again. Ethan helped her dress in a loose blouse so the bandage on her arm wouldn't chafe too much. Over it, a dark sweater. She also asked for her shawl so she wouldn't be cold on the way, though she knew the chill that worried her wasn't temperature but nerves. Catherine arrived on time, as promised, with her bulging briefcase and a coffee for each of them. Today, we don't talk about fear, the lawyer said as they walked to the car. Today, we talk about facts, and the facts are on our side. The drive to the courthouse was silent. From the back seat, Alice watched the streets she had known all her life, which now seemed different, as if the world had hardened to observe what was about to happen. Upon arrival, the building loomed before them, a mass of gray concrete with tall columns and a glass door that revealed a lobby full of people and echoing footsteps. At the entrance, a guard checked Catherine's ID and showed them the way. They went down a hallway lit by large windows, letting in the cold morning light. Alice clutched the rosary in her pocket. She wasn't praying for a miracle. She was praying for the truth to be heard. The assigned courtroom was sober, with beige walls and a raised dais for the judge. The flag leaned slightly from the draft, escaping the air conditioner. At the central table, the clerk organized papers. To one side, 2 tables, one for the defense, one for the complainant. Catherine took her place and began arranging documents. 1. The deed proving that Alice's room and yard were hers by right. 2. The medical report signed by Dr. Emily with the diagnosis of second-degree burns and a record of old injuries. 3. Photographs taken the day of the assault and of previous marks. 4. Transcripts of audio threats with precise dates and times. 5. Signed witness statements. Megan and Robert entered together, but with an invisible distance between them. Megan wore a formal dress, her lips pressed tight. Robert, with a wrinkled shirt and a defeated look, avoided looking at Alice. She, however, met their gaze head-on, without lowering her eyes. When the judge entered, everyone stood. His voice was grave, and in few words he made it clear he would not tolerate interruptions. Catherine rose and began her presentation. Your Honor, this case is a clear example of repeated violence against a senior citizen. My client, Mrs. Alice Miller, has been the victim of documented physical and psychological assault and threats. The judge nodded and motioned for her to present the evidence. Catherine first handed over the deed, highlighting that the space where Alice lived legally belonged to her. Then, the medical report, detailing the recent and old injuries. Each document passed through the clerk's hands, who stamped it and placed it on the judge's desk. Catherine continued. Here, photographs taken the day of the assault, showing burns on the right arm, as well as images of old injuries that, according to the doctor, are consistent with physical abuse. Megan scoffed and opened her mouth to interrupt, but the judge tapped the gavel lightly. Ma'am, in this courtroom, you speak only when instructed, Catherine continued. Furthermore, I present audio recordings made by my client's grandson, in which Mrs. Megan Miller issues direct threats. One day I'm dragging her out of the house. I'll get her out, even if I have to kick her out. These files include metadata confirming their authenticity. Robert lowered his head further. Ethan, from the front row, didn't take his eyes off him, as if wanting to burn that image into his memory, the image of a man who chose to be silent. We also have witness statements. Mrs. Helen, a neighbor, who witnessed shoves. Gary, who heard insults and threats. And Jason, a delivery man, who saw bruises and aggressive treatment on repeated occasions. All have signed and provided a copy of their identification. The judge glanced at the statements and nodded, looking at Megan and Robert like someone sizing up pieces on a chessboard. Any objections? He asked. This is all twisted, Megan said, leaning forward. She always provoked me. Silence, the judge ordered, his tone sterner this time. If you interrupt again, you will be removed from the courtroom. Alice, rosary in her hands, didn't move. She felt her fingers tracing the path of each bead with the same calm her lawyer used to enumerate the evidence. There was no trembling, no insecurity, just a conviction that grew with every document the judge accepted. Catherine placed the last file on the table. The judge, after reviewing the collection, leaned toward the clerk. Proceed with playing the audio files in the order presented, announcing the date and time before each one. The courtroom fell into an expectant hush. In seconds, the voices that had been trapped in a phone would fill that cold, formal space. And they would no longer be hallway whispers or neighbors' comments. They would be official evidence, recorded forever in a court record. To hear those words again in the quiet, it hurt. But for the first time, I was not hearing them alone. The whole room heard them. And this time, the truth had weight. Enough weight to crush the lies. The room was so quiet, you could hear the rustle of pages as the judge's clerk arranged the case file on the desk. The air conditioning blew a cold draft, but Alice felt a different kind of warmth, the kind born from nerves and expectation. Sitting in the front row, her rosary tangled in her fingers, she glanced sideways at Ethan, who was holding her hand tightly. The judge, a man with salt and pepper hair and a sharp gaze, reviewed the documents the lawyer had submitted. There was no rush in his movements, but his every gesture landed with the weight of a gavel. Across from him, Megan kept her arms crossed, chin high, as if this were all just a simple misunderstanding. Robert, beside her, seemed to shrink further and further into his chair, unable to meet anyone's gaze. "Proceed with playing the first audio file," the judge ordered, without raising his voice. The clerk connected a small speaker to the equipment, and after a brief crackle, the room filled with the sharp timbre of Megan's voice. "Nosy old woman. One day I'm dragging her out by the hair if I have to. I'm sick of seeing her in my kitchen." A murmur went through the room. Alice pressed her lips together, feeling how that phrase, heard so many times in private, was now exposed before everyone. The judge raised an eyebrow and asked for the next file. The second audio was even more violent. Megan, screaming, threatened to break her useless hands if she touched the pots again. There it is, the proof, ringing out for the entire court to hear. Those secret, cruel whispers are now public evidence. Megan's true nature is exposed, and there's no way to take those words back. Now, all eyes are on the judge. The voice was crystal clear, every word loaded with contempt. Ethan stared at his mother with a mixture of outrage and sadness. "Do you recognize your voice in these recordings?" the judge asked Megan. "That's taken out of context," she replied, shrugging. Alice's lawyer leaned forward. "There is no context that justifies threats like that against an elderly person. Furthermore, the dates coincide with the injuries certified by Dr. Emily." The judge nodded and asked for the medical report. Dr. Emily rose from her seat and, with a steady gait, handed over the document. Her voice was clear. The burns on the right arm were caused by contact with a high-temperature liquid. They presented redness, incipient blisters, and acute pain. The pattern of the injuries is consistent with the direct pouring of scalding coffee. Furthermore, in previous checkups, I had already noted bruises on the upper left arm and on the shoulder. The judge glanced at the report and then fixed his eyes on Robert. "Mr. Robert, were you aware of these assaults?" Robert swallowed. I knew they argued, but," he stammered, not daring to finish the sentence. "I must remind you that silence in the face of a crime of this nature is considered complicity," the judge said firmly. The weight of that word hung in the air. Complicity. Ethan felt his grandmother's hand tremble slightly, and he squeezed it tighter. The lawyer intervened again. "Your Honor, these audio files, combined with the testimonies and the medical report, form a pattern of constant abuse. My client has lived under physical and psychological threat for years, and today we request immediate measures to guarantee her safety." The judge remained silent for a few seconds. The clerk's typing could be heard, registering every word. From the back, some attendees craned their necks, as if expecting a sentence right then and there. Megan shifted in her seat, her fingers drumming. Robert kept his head down, unable to look at his mother. Alice breathed deeply, feeling that every second was bringing her closer to a point of no return. "The court takes note," the judge finally said. "We will proceed to issue immediate measures after a final evaluation of the evidence." The tension in the room became almost physical. The murmuring returned, but this time with a different tone: disbelief at the rawness of the evidence and a silent approval of the elderly woman's courage in deciding not to be silent anymore. Alice, without taking her eyes off the bench, knew something had changed forever, and although the ruling had not yet been pronounced, she could feel that for the first time in a long time, her voice and her pain were being heard where it truly mattered. The judge's gavel struck the wood with a dry echo that spread through the courtroom. Everyone present leaned forward, as if that sound were the signal that something concrete was finally about to be decided. The judge's voice, grave and measured, filled the space. "This court has meticulously reviewed the evidence presented. Audio files, photographs, the medical report, witness testimonies, and the complainant's own statement. In light of the severity of the facts and the proven risk to the physical and emotional integrity of Mrs. Alice Miller, the following resolution is issued." The murmuring died instantly. Ethan squeezed his grandmother's hand. She could feel her grandson's pulse racing, almost in rhythm with her own. First, immediate protective measures are granted in favor of Mrs. Alice Miller, effective immediately. Alice held her breath. Second, the citizen, Megan Miller, is prohibited from approaching within 100 yards of the complainant, her residence, or any place she frequents. Megan's face changed color. Her lips pressed together so tightly they looked like a tense line. The lawyer, Catherine, didn't take her eyes off the judge, taking quick notes. Third, Mrs. Megan Miller must vacate the residence she shares with the complainant within a maximum period of 48 hours from the official notification of this resolution. 48 hours. Those are the words Alice has been waiting years to hear. Justice isn't just a word, it's a moving truck. But don't celebrate just yet. Megan is furious, and she still has 2 days left in that house. You won't believe what she tries next. A stifled sigh escaped Alice, so faint only Ethan heard it. The image of her kitchen, her room, and her yard without that hostile presence seemed like a possible dream for the first time in years. Fourth, a formal investigation is opened against the citizen, Robert Miller, for the alleged crime of complicity, having failed to report and stop the assaults against his mother. Robert snapped his head up, as if he hadn't understood. Complicity? He stammered, but the judge cut him off with a sharp gesture. Fifth, the local police and victim protection services will be responsible for supervising compliance with this order and safeguarding the complainant's safety. The judge closed the folder with a final thud. This session is adjourned. The murmuring returned, more intense. Some attendees exchanged looks of approval. Others quietly discussed the harshness of the ruling. Catherine leaned toward Alice. We did it. Now begins the most important part. Protecting you and ensuring this order is followed to the letter. Ethan wrapped his grandmother in a tight hug. She felt her body, which had been tense for days, finally begin to relax. It wasn't the end, but it was a giant step toward reclaiming her home and her peace. As they walked toward the exit, the courthouse hallways felt long, as if every footstep distanced them from a shadow that had hung over them for too long. The air outside was colder, but also cleaner. Alice closed her eyes for a second and let the wind brush her face. Halfway to the main door, a sharp ring broke the moment. Ethan's phone was vibrating in his pocket. He hesitated, but answered. Megan's voice, loaded with fury, exploded on the other end. You think you've won? This isn't over. You haven't seen the last of me. Ethan didn't reply. He hung up without a word and put the phone back in his pocket. He looked at his grandmother and smiled. Although his eyes revealed the tension of what was yet to come, Alice, in contrast, stood up a little straighter. The ruling had given her something she thought she had lost, the certainty that she could resist, and that the time for bowing her head was over. The 48 hours passed like a countdown marked by a tense silence in the house. Megan, who had always walked as if she owned the space, now crossed the hallway with quick, sharp steps, avoiding Alice's gaze. In the kitchen, the pots remained in their places, untouched. In the living room, the television remained off. The lawyer, Catherine, had made it clear that any provocation would be grounds to stiffen the measures, and Megan, begrudgingly, held her tongue. On the morning of the second day, an old truck parked in front of the house. Robert got out, frowning, avoiding greeting Ethan, who watched him from the door. He went straight to the room and began helping Megan carry down boxes, bags, and suitcases. The sound of zippers and objects bumping against each other filled the house with a strange echo, as if the place itself were expelling its aggressors. Alice remained at the dining room table with a hot cup of coffee in her hands. She didn't say a word, but her eyes followed every movement. She had waited for this moment more times than she could count, but she never imagined it would arrive with such calm. There were no screams, no insults, just the sound of two people gathering what no longer belonged to them. Megan passed by her, carrying a large suitcase. Their eyes met for a second. Hers was loaded with resentment. Alice's was firm as a rock. This isn't over, Megan muttered before walking out the door. Robert, without looking at her, took out the last boxes. His face showed no anger, only resigned exhaustion. On the street, they loaded everything into the truck. A neighbor passing by saw them and looked away. Another, from the corner, turned around so as not to greet them. It was as if the entire neighborhood had decided that those two figures no longer deserved to be part of their landscape. The vehicle started and disappeared down the narrow streets. Alice exhaled slowly, as if lifting an invisible weight from her chest. Do you know what the air in your own home smells like when the cruelty has moved out? It smells like hope, like new paint, and like coffee, the kind no one can ever use as a weapon against you again. It wasn't complete freedom, but the air inside the house already felt different. On the outskirts of the city, Megan and Robert rented a room in a cheap motel. The place smelled of dampness and old grease. The owner, a woman with a harsh voice, asked for payment up front and made it clear she didn't offer credit. The next morning, Robert went out to look for work in the local area. The interviews he had scheduled seemed to evaporate as soon as he said his name. At the neighborhood hardware store, the manager told him the position was already filled. At a local diner, the receptionist looked at him uncomfortably before asking him to leave his information. The rumor of what had happened, at least in this part of town, traveled faster than he did. Megan, for her part, visited a few stores asking if they needed help. The answer was always the same: we're fully staffed. At a bakery, the clerk gave her a look that said more than any words, and Megan left without insisting. While they faced a world that was now closing its doors to them, things at Alice's house were beginning to change. Ethan arrived early with a new set of locks and a can of paint. They removed the old lock, replacing it with a new one that turned smoothly and closed with a clean click. Then they covered the window frames with a fresh coat of white paint. The smell of paint and fresh coffee mixed in the air. Alice, wearing a scarf on her head to protect her hair, watched as the light streamed freely through the open windows. There were no harsh voices, no heavy footsteps behind her, just the sound of brushes and Ethan's laugh when a drop of paint landed on his cheek. "You know, Grandma," he said, adjusting the lock, "now this house is yours again." She smiled, feeling that those words were more than a comfort. They were a declaration of victory. At the end of the afternoon, as they were putting the tools away, a courier arrived at the door with an official envelope. He handed it to Ethan, who opened it and read aloud. "Notification to citizen Robert Miller. You must appear before this tribunal to answer for the crime of complicity in the assault of Alice Miller. Date, next week." Alice closed her eyes for an instant. She didn't feel hatred, but she did feel the certainty that justice was moving forward, step by step, in her favor. The morning light poured in through the freshly painted windows, casting a golden glow on the walls that, until a few days ago, were dulled by dust and neglect. The smell of fresh paint mingled with the damp perfume of the yard plants. Outside, the sky was clear, barely marked by the slow flight of a pair of doves that, as if they knew something had changed in that house, perched on the wall without hurry. Ethan, leaning in the doorway, nodded seriously. Ever since Megan threw the scalding coffee on her, he hadn't left his grandmother alone for a single medical appointment. A soft knock on the gate interrupted them. Catherine, the lawyer, was there. She had a thick folder under her arm and her phone in her hand. She entered without preamble, joined them at the yard table, and dropped the folder onto the wooden surface, which creaked slightly under the weight. "I come with good news," she announced. "The protective order is holding firm. The judge ratified it with all the evidence, the medical report, the photos, the audio files, and the testimonies. If they try to get close or violate the order, the police can arrest them on the spot." Alice listened in silence. Although her face remained serene, a slight glint in her eyes revealed that those words were an anchor after weeks of turmoil. After sharing a coffee that Ethan served in ceramic mugs, Alice stood up, went to her room, and returned with a worn, hardcover notebook. She placed it on the table, opened it to a clean page, and in a firm hand, wrote at the top, "What is mine again?" Dr. Emily and Catherine exchanged a look. Alice began to list. 1. My bed, because I can rest there without fear of someone pounding on the door. For years, every knock made me wake up with my heart pounding in my chest. Now I close my eyes and know no one will burst in. 2. My kitchen. It's not just the place where I cook food. It's where I can move without being looked at with contempt or having the pot snatched from my hands. 3. My yard. My plan don't hear screaming. They flourish freely here, and I with them. 4. My laughter. They had stolen it from me. Today, I hear it in my own voice and in my grandson's. Ethan smiled and added quietly, "And your piece, Grandma?" Alice wrote, "5. My piece. Because it's worth more than anything." At that moment, Catherine's phone vibrated on the table. She picked it up, frowned, and said, "It's a voicemail from Megan." She put it on speaker. Megan's voice sounded clear, furious. "Let's go back and drag her out at night." The silence that followed was thick. Catherine calmly put the phone away. "This is going straight into the file," she affirmed. "If they follow through on that threat, they not only break the order, they expose themselves to immediate arrest and a new criminal charge." Dr. Emily pressed her lips together. Ethan clenched his fists, but Alice took a breath and said in a tone that allowed no reply, "I'm not moving again. This is my house." The rest of the day was filled with different sounds. The clatter of Ethan's tools, the water falling on the earth, the murmur of quiet conversations. In the kitchen, the aroma of sweet bread mixed with that of a stew bubbling in the pot. Every detail spoke of a life that, though marked by scars, was rebuilding itself from within. Before sleeping, Alice returned to the notebook and wrote, 6. My right to not be afraid. She closed the cover, turned off the light, and for the first time in a long time, fell asleep without hearing hostile footsteps in the hallway. Outside, the neighborhood was alive, but inside the house, dignity felt like a solid wall. The morning began with a cold air slipping through the cracks, bringing with it the smell of fresh-baked bread from the corner bakery. Alice was sitting at the yard table with the notebook open in front of her and a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. The steam caressed her face, and with every sip, she felt the warmth settle in her stomach like an embrace. It wasn't long before she heard the sound of firm footsteps approaching. It was Catherine, the lawyer, with a serious expression and a new folder under her arm. They greeted each other with a brief handshake, but Catherine didn't sit down right away. She placed the folder on the table and spoke clearly. "Alice, we've listened to all the recordings, and this last voicemail from Megan changes the picture. It's not just a potential violation of the order, it's a direct threat. I'm going to request an additional warning and have it entered into the record." Alice nodded, her gaze fixed on the notebook, as if the words were also being engraved on those pages. Ethan, who was repairing a window frame, came closer to listen. Catherine continued, "If they take one more step, the penalty won't be a simple fine. It will be criminal, and they could face jail time." There was no drama in her voice, only the firmness of someone who knows the weight of the law. Alice swallowed, and Ethan clenched his fists. Hours later, at the courthouse, the atmosphere was sober. The white walls reflected the light from the tall windows, and the silence was broken only by the echo of footsteps and the rustling of folders on desks. The judge, wearing rectangular glasses and with a thick file in front of him, listened to Catherine's presentation. When Megan's voicemail was played on speaker, the room went still. "Let's go back and drag her out at night," the voice rang out, thick with rage. Even after losing in court, her arrogance is unbelievable. Threatening Alice again, on a voicemail? That single, angry message is the biggest mistake she could have made. Megan just handed the lawyer all the ammunition she needs to end this for good. Stick around to hear the judge's final word. The judge paused before speaking. He looked at Megan, then at Robert, and finally at the clerk who was taking notes. "It is hereby noted that any attempt to approach, at any time of day or night, will be considered contempt of the court order and will result in immediate criminal action. Both parties are notified." Megan avoided his gaze, and Robert shrank in his seat, muttering something that not even the judge tried to decipher. The warning left no room for interpretation. Outside the courtroom, the tension morphed into a heavy silence. Megan and Robert walked quickly to the street, and although they tried to hide it, the weight of the situation was reflected in their faces. They knew their room to maneuver had shrunk to almost nothing. The following days were a silent descent for them. They tried to borrow money from an acquaintance of Robert's, a man he used to share drinks with at night. They met on a park bench under the shade of an old ash tree. The man listened with his arms crossed, and when Robert finished speaking, he slowly shook his head. "I don't get involved in other people's problems," he said, getting up without looking back. With their savings gone and no stable work, they were forced to cut costs. They stopped eating at diners and began to depend on cheap canned goods. The room they rented on the outskirts had damp walls and a musty smell that clung to their clothes. Each day that passed, the phone rang less. Friends evaporated like smoke. Meanwhile, life at Alice's house began to regain a rhythm she thought was lost. The neighbors, hearing the latest news, started stopping by more often. Some knocked on the gate to say hello. Others left bread, a bag of fruit, or simply a few words of encouragement. It was about time all this changed, Mrs. Helen told her, leaning on her cane. You were always good to everyone, Alice. One afternoon, as the sun set and the sky turned shades of orange, several neighbors invited her to sit out on the sidewalk. It was an old custom from when the nights were cool and people could chat without fear. Alice accepted. She wore a shawl over her shoulders, her short hair neatly combed. Ethan sat beside her, listening to the stories that flowed back and forth amid laughter and shared memories. In that moment, she realized something essential had returned, a sense of belonging. She was no longer trapped within four walls, afraid of what might happen. She was surrounded by people who knew her and valued her. As the night deepened and the lights in the houses began to turn on, Alice returned to the yard with a strange but welcome peace. She was hanging up her shawl when she heard the familiar sound of a motorcycle approaching. It was Ethan. He came in with a can of paint in one hand and, hanging from the other arm, a bag with 2 new mugs wrapped in newspaper. "So we can paint the gate and drink coffee like we used to," he said, smiling. Alice took the mugs, feeling the ceramic weight as if it were a symbol. Life wasn't solved, but now there were tools, willing hands, and a clear path forward that no longer included looking back. The morning sun filtered softly through the new curtains, drawing golden lines on the freshly varnished wooden table. Alice was standing in the kitchen, stirring a spoon inside a clean coffee pot that gave off a deep, comforting aroma. The steam rose in slow spirals, as if it wanted to float forever in that place which, after months of battle, was beginning to feel like a real home again. The wall clock struck 8 o'clock when Ethan entered, his hair still damp from the shower. He paused for a moment at the door, watching his grandmother place the 2 new mugs on the table with the precision of someone who knows the value of every small gesture. She had chosen those mugs carefully. White, thick ceramic, with a blue rim that reminded her of the old dishes from her childhood. "Smells good," Ethan commented, walking closer. Alice smiled without looking at him, concentrating on pouring the coffee slowly, careful not to spill a single drop. The sound of the liquid, filling the mugs, mingled with the distant song of a canary in the neighboring house and the rumble of the street waking up. They sat down, facing each other. Alice took the mug in her hands, and before bringing it to her lips, looked at her grandson with a gentle seriousness. "This coffee," she paused, as if wanting to measure her words, "is only served with love." Ethan held her gaze and nodded. He knew exactly what she meant. It wasn't just a hot drink. It was the symbol of everything they had defended together. The right to live in peace, without fear, without humiliation, without hostile hands near the stove. The neighborhood, which had been a silent witness and then an active accomplice in her defense, had not forgotten. From the window, she could see Mrs. Helen waving with her cane, Gary holding up a bag of fresh bread, and children running with backpacks on. Every greeting, every smile, was a reminder that Alice was not alone, and that her dignity was also a collective victory. As they took slow sips, the walls seemed stronger, the air lighter. Alice had reclaimed her bed, her kitchen, her yard, and most importantly, the feeling that her house was a safe place. The pots she watered every morning were full of new flowers, and the windows, once kept closed as a precaution, remained open to let in the light and air. In another part of the city, far from that harmony, Megan and Robert occupied a rented room that smelled of dampness and loneliness. The walls were bare, and the mattress, old and sagging in the middle, seemed to resist offering any rest. The phone hardly ever rang. Acquaintances avoided speaking to them, and in the new neighborhood stores, no one would give them credit. The hostility wasn't overt, but it was felt in the indifference, in the way people averted their gaze, in the lack of invitations or simple good mornings. Robert spent his afternoons smoking by the broken window, watching the street, aimless. Megan, thinner and with her hair unkempt, reviewed the old messages on her phone over and over, as if she could relive a time when she was still in control. But no new messages came, and the old ones only reminded her of the path that had led them to this point. While they sank into that anonymity, Alice continued to wake up early to turn on the coffee pot, open the windows, and sweep the yard. The sound of the broom on the pavement was almost a daily hymn, a silent declaration that life went on, and it did so with her standing tall. That morning, after finishing their coffee, Ethan got up to paint the window frame with the can he had brought days earlier. Alice watched him from the table, feeling a peace she hadn't known in a long time. Each brushstroke covered not only the worn wood, but also the invisible wounds of months of violence and tension. The phone rang. It was Dr. Emily, the doctor, asking about the healing of the burns. Alice assured her the skin was better and no longer hurt. "Doctor," Emily's voice conveyed satisfaction, like someone confirming a battle has been won. When Ethan finished, he came back to the table. Alice poured a second, milder coffee, and they sat down again. Outside, the neighborhood was alive. Children shouting, a radio playing country music, the clinking of glasses in a nearby kitchen. "You know what the best part is?" Alice said, looking at the steam rising from her mug. "This coffee doesn't burn." Ethan smiled, and in that instant, the camera, imaginary or real, seemed to freeze on that detail. The gentle, slow steam wrapping the air like a hug. There were no screams, no violent hands, no fear. Just a warmth that comforts, that unites, that is offered with generosity. In that steam, Alice reflected everything she had reclaimed: her voice, her space, her tranquility. And as life went on outside, she knew that moment would be etched forever, not as an ending, but as the beginning of a time when she could finally live without looking over her shoulder. Alice looked at the steam, then at her own hands. The right arm would always carry a scar, a pale, silvery map of that terrible morning. For a long time, she had believed her life was defined by the wounds others gave her. But now, she understood. The scar was not a symbol of her pain. It was a symbol of her survival. It was the price she paid to reclaim her own voice. She learned that true strength isn't about never falling. It's about what you do when you are on the floor. She had chosen to get up. She had chosen to heal. And this coffee, the one she held now, wasn't just a drink. It was a promise to herself. She would never be invisible again. If this story touched you, comment the word home and tell me where you watched it from. Subscribe for more stories. Thank you for staying until the end, and may God bless you always.